today's video, I'm going to be glitching out the subscribe button's little rainbow thing because I don't know why. By doing that, I'm going to have to say subscribe 100 times, and I'm going to probably count in my head or write something down saying that I did it. That first one to the 100th. Or 150 or 200. I think I'm going to do 200, who knows. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get to the video. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. And if I cut the video, I'm just counting up the tallies so I'm not messing up. Subscribe, 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 Among Us. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Anyway, comments. Down in the comments, comment down below. Subscribe, 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 subscribe right now. Subscribe, subscribe, leave a like, comment, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 sub. Come on. Subscribe, 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 subscription, 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 subscribe, subscription, 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 subscribe. Those do count, by the way. Even though I'm not saying subscribe, we can gloss over that really quickly. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back in Black. Subscribe, 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 Skype, 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 subscribe, 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 subscribe. We're gonna end it for today. I reached 175. Bet my original and bet my advanced, which was the original was 100, advanced was 150. I bet those two. So if you want to see it, here we go. It's kind of hard to see it. Yeah, that was that's why I was cutting out the thing. I was counting each tally mark. Yeah, I was counting each one out. I'm going to break the subscribe button for sure. The reason why I'm doing this is because YouTube has that new feature with the subscribe button, which is glows every time. It's a cool little secret. When someone says subscribe, it glows up. So I'm taking that to my advantage, and I'm breaking the subscribe button. So anyways, that's it for today's video. Make sure to leave a like, and you know what I'm gonna say. Peace out.